Hello, I'm CCSU President Jack Miller. The video that you're about to see is a culmination of many hours of dedicated work put forth by the faculty, staff, and most importantly, students here at the university. Along with a traditional classroom educational experience, this type of hands-on learning experience is what we look to bring our students at Central. At the same time, we intend to give back to the community through research and facilitation of programs which address a range of critical issues and opportunities. Our applied research centers, such as the Institute for the Study of Crime and Justice and the Governor William A. O'Neill Endowed Chair, are great mechanisms for fostering these mutually beneficial interactions. In this instance, our students and faculty have gained invaluable knowledge and experience by working with professionals in their fields of study. In turn, by presenting a historical retrospective of criminal justice policy initiatives here in Connecticut, it's our aim to be a resource to those who would benefit from having this knowledge readily available in video form. It is in this context that I present to you Connecticut's criminal justice system, a timeline of major policy initiatives within the past 30 years.
Crime stuff is a little different than a lot of the major issues that legislators deal with because if it's a tax increase or a tax cut, or if it's a change in healthcare policy, or like the philosophical issues like abortion or gay rights or whatever it happens to be, there's all kinds of organized interest groups out there who are very active, in many cases very well funded, and in the case of anything that affects the private sector, you're talking about serious money being thrown around, campaign contributions, buying ads on TV, that kind of stuff. But crime politics are a little different. As a general rule, there aren't a lot of lobbyists who are making a lot of money arguing or lobbying one way or the other on crime stuff. That's just not part of this dynamic.
In 1979, the Connecticut General Assembly created a sentencing commission to establish policies and practices for the state criminal justice system to ensure the sentencing goals of punishment, deterrence, incapacitation, and rehabilitation were accomplished.
Well, prison overcrowding came in the early 80s, really. We had two things were going on. We were dealing with one, truth in sentencing. They use that word pretty loosely, but truth in sentencing was, in the beginning, a desire to let offenders and their families know what was going on. If you read the testimony from that period of time, people would then said sentence from what they used to call an indeterminate sentence, and you get sentenced from 9 months to 2.5 years, and never knew when your release date was.
In 1980, then Governor Ella Grasso appointed members to a task force to address the problem of prison overcrowding. In 1981, Connecticut shifted from an indeterminate sentencing model by adopting a determinate model with legislatively set sentencing options and ranges. Under the new sentencing model, 3 reforms also took place. First, parole was abolished for new determinate sentences. Introduced along with the restructuring of the parole system was an early release program called Supervised Home Release, which transferred discretionary early release authority and community supervision to the Department of Correction. Supervised home release replaced parole for inmates sentenced to determinate sentences. Second, the amount of good time credits that could be earned for sentences over 5 years was reduced. Third, the General Assembly began to establish mandatory minimum sentences for certain offenses, increasing existing mandatory minimum penalties and enacting enhanced penalties under the first in a series of persistent offender provisions. The cumulative impact of these sentencing reforms was a sizable increase in the prison population. In the early 1980s, the incarcerated population was already at design capacity levels, and the prison system could not accommodate the influx of inmates. Connecticut experienced its first prison overcrowding crisis.
Well, I think some of the initial contributing factors For one, the shift from indeterminate to determinate sentencing proved to cause the problem to worsen. And that's because under determinate sentencing, when the court would mete out fixed sentences, a single year, for example, rather than a range, they tended to give higher sentences. So that helped perhaps to bring more people into the correctional system, but more importantly, those who came in ended up serving longer time than they did under the old indeterminate structure.
In 1982, one consequence of the tremendous growth in the prison population was the establishment by federal court order and state law of Department of Correction institutional capacity limits and the adoption of a statutory emergency release provision.
There were court intervention at the period of time. Overcrowding dealt with people who were living in dormitories, stacked up, 3, 4 people in a cell intended for 1 or 2 people. And so that became cruel and inhumane, in quotes, at that point in time. We responded to it. So as we're going into what kind of sentencing law we're going to have, how we're going to make it fair, not only to the families and the individual, but the public. Public wants to know. Of course, they're never happy what that result is, but the public wants to know when the let loose date is, when it's supposed to be free. So that was one of the motivations going on at that period of time. Again, court cases, and we didn't want to willy-nilly release of people. And so I think we invented a system of early release, if you will, or for jail overcrowding purposes, which kept the most serious in, they were excluded, and we let people who served the most time out earlier.
In 1984, the Sentencing Commission reported to the General Assembly the new determinate sentencing law had not produced its intended effect and had instead contributed to the growing prison overcrowding problem. That year also saw the General Assembly amend the 1982 emergency release provision.
The concern we had in the mid-'80s regarding overcrowding and the concern about the court order about overcrowding in the system, where Judge Cabranes had the system under an order regarding overcrowding, where if we exceeded capacity or exceeded 110% of capacity for 31 consecutive days, on that 31st day, 10% of the prisoners would have to be released, and we came pretty close to that trigger a few points. So that created a lot of other programs, diversionary programs, to get people out of the system. The supervised home release program and a number of others were measures that were taken at the time when the prison construction program was underway.
In the mid-1980s, Connecticut initiated a long-term prison expansion project with plans for over 10,000 new prison beds. In Connecticut and nationally, the crack epidemic is cited for the rise in drug-related violent and weapon offenses and organized gang activity. As a result, in 1987, during a special session, the General Assembly enacted a series of mandatory minimum sentencing laws for drug sale offenses.
In no area did things change as much as they did in the drug law stuff. I mean, nationally and here in Connecticut, there was a big emphasis on prosecuting drug crimes. And today, I guess the estimates are 75, 80, 85% of the people in prison are there either for drug or alcohol-related reasons. And quite a few of them are in there just for drug law violations per se. So possession of drugs, sale of narcotics, that kind of stuff. And you know, a lot of them are also charged with violent crimes. I mean, they're trafficking in guns and drugs, or they're assaulting people, or you know, in the crack epidemic, there was a lot of shootings that went on because of that. But those changes resulted in this huge increase in the prison population.
All criminal justice agencies responded within their jurisdiction and authority to organized gang activity. The system focused on arresting, convicting, and incarcerating serious, violent offenders.
We saw public confidence waning because of incidents of violence, some escalating crime rates, which were everyone's concern, gang violence in the cities, and I think that folks took a very Victorian attitude toward, well, let's get these problems off of our streets and into the prisons where we'll never have to think about them. And you can attend to that problem in prison, where we'd rather not think about prisons either. Those problems importing into the prison and then having the crowding situation as it was, many of these folks were cycling in and out of the jails in the prison system in Connecticut.
In the late 1980s, the serious prison overcrowding crisis continued.
The year I got elected was 1986, and that was right at the moment Connecticut was reaching the maximum stress with prison overcrowding. That's when we had supervised home release at the time, which at the end of the day meant that inmates got out after they served about 10% of their sentences. There was this big complicated formula for taking time off. So you got regular good time, then there was like outstanding and meritorious good time, and then there was some type of discretionary good time. And by the time you whittled it down, if you had gotten a 10-year sentence, you got out after about a year. That's what it worked out to be. And I think that, for obvious reasons, I guess, had people very concerned.
By the mid to late 1980s, there was less certainty in sentencing. There was greater post-sentence discretion in the form of the supervised home release program, and greater difficulty for victims, prosecutors, and offenders themselves to have any idea as to when they would be released.
So I actually saw offenders do 3 days on a year, and they were in my office sitting in front of me on supervised home release, which had taken the place of parole.
In 1988, if you'll recall, that there was a presidential election that year where the Democrat was Michael Dukakis, and the main commercial against him was the Willie Horton commercial, the revolving door. And so at that time, crime politics really characterized national and state level elections. I mean, it was all about that, who was tough on crime, who wasn't. And I think it was at that point, 88, 89, 90, that's when a lot of the minimum mandatory type sentences were enacted. The sentences got longer, and you had to serve a bigger percentage of them. A lot of the crack cocaine laws and the minimum mandatories for drugs, and then in addition, of course, all the violent stuff.
In 1989, the General Assembly established the Alternative Incarceration Program, authorizing judges to impose an alternative sanction in lieu of prison for persons convicted of certain crimes who would have, absent the program, been incarcerated. In 1990, the Transitional Supervision Program was created, giving the Department of Correction discretionary early release authority for inmates sentenced to 2 years or less. Also that year, the passage of Public Act 90-213, the Office of Alternative Sanctions, was statutorily created.
Alternative sanctions actually came out of the legislature in the late 1980s. And by that point in time, I think the state was had its fill on prison building. Prison building proved to be very, very expensive, and Connecticut had a very large prison building program, some 11,000 beds that were going to cost well over $1 billion to build. And then, of course, once they open, it's a significant increase on the operating side of the budget to pay for the guards and the treatment and all the upkeep of the facilities. Connecticut, I think, had also had its fill of the political problems with prison building, because while public opinion polls were showing that people, by and large, supported it, when those prisons were being built near where they lived, they did not support it. And so by the late 1980s, they were tired of the home release program, you know, where thousands of inmates had been released early without proper supervision and without services, and they were going back into the communities, back into the drug crime cycle and back into the system. So many of them committed some very serious crimes while out in the community, got a lot of attention. So I think there was an eagerness. I think the state was at that point hungry for a new solution to the problem that wasn't going to break the budget, because you have to remember it was at this time in the late 80s that the state was going into debt. This is just prior to the enactment of the income tax in '91. But they were looking for a new solution that would be credible, that wouldn't compromise public safety, and would be cost effective. And so it's at that point that we introduced the concept of alternative sanctions.
Connecticut does have a model system of alternative sanctions. I've been to many jurisdictions in the country, and they are all marveled by the number and range of programs that have occurred in Connecticut as the leader. That's under the Judicial Department, was the Office of Alternative Sanctions. I believe it's the Court Support Services Division now, but they've done a fine job with that over many years of this crowding problem that we have had.
Also in 1990, new state law established and initiated a 3-year phase-out of supervised home release by 1993. In the early 90s, the Board of Parole was statutorily established as an independent state agency.
Traditionally, the Department of Correction has been responsible for supervision of offenders released from correctional facilities. And the Board of Parole, again, traditionally was responsible for making the release decisions and making decisions whether or not to revoke paroles. There had always been some tension between those two entities, culminating in legislation in 1994, which consolidated parole release decision-making, parole supervision, and parole violation decision-making, all within the auspices of an independent Board of Parole.
During the late 80s and when parole was reinstituted in the 1990s, public safety in the state of Connecticut, as well as the rest of the country, I think was more in a crime control era. Lock them up, 3 strikes and you're out, mandatory minimum sentencing. So I think, having worked at the parole board during most of that time, if not all of it, the board took a very conservative approach to letting offenders out of prison for fear that they release the wrong person and the wrong person end up in the headlines. So the board, like the rest of, I think, the Connecticut criminal justice system, was very conservative through those years, and would oftentimes discharge people, would allow them to go to their end of sentence without any community supervision, which in retrospect is probably a disservice to the state of Connecticut.
The mid-90s saw a culmination of the national trend towards a tough-on-crime approach to criminal justice. In 1995, the General Assembly followed suit by enacting a truth in sentencing law.
The final sort of element that came into play was the truth in sentencing, which required minimum time served before eligibility or appearance before the parole board. Violent offenders, of course, is the target for everyone. Those are very serious public safety offenders. You want to ensure that the most dangerous people and those that our society in general is most concerned with are incapacitated for a period of time. And again, 85% against what was under the same indeterminate sentencing model, 50% eligibility where many offenders made it. Now they were up with these larger sentences. In fact, even the discretion on many offenses increased the minimum that would be required to be served and increased the maximum which a person was eligible to be sentenced under. So all those things collectively came together in a progression which basically caused a large number of offenders to not just come into the system but remain in the system for a longer period of time, resulting in the greatest crowding we've ever seen in the state of Connecticut.
When I got here in August of 1996, it was following the gang problems in the bigger cities in Connecticut, so the emphasis seemed to be on incarceration and incarcerating offenders to get them off the streets to increase public safety.
In 1996, the Department of Correction completed its 10-year prison expansion project.
In Connecticut, the Prison and Jail Overcrowding Commission, when they met from the 80s and through the 90s, took the posture that expanding the capacity of our prisons, our buildings, our cells, our housing units was one way to deal with this rising population. But even then, we couldn't build our way out of it. We spent $1 billion in the state of Connecticut in expanding our prison capacity and our jail capacity. But you can't keep building your way out of this issue. You have to really think about who's being incarcerated and what really is the purpose of incarceration, and then take a look to see what offenders could best be served in the community without a risk to public safety.
We didn't have the capacity in state. We had to look toward alternative housing, just like we did when we were severely overcrowded previously. So even with all the investment in the infrastructure of the agency, we still had a lack of appropriate spaces, particularly because Connecticut chose to fast-track construction. Most of what was built was dormitory spaces, which were not appropriate for higher security offenders who require cell spaces.
In 1999, the Department of Correction entered into a one-year renewable contract with the Virginia Department of Correction to transfer 484 Connecticut inmates to the Wallens Ridge Prison, a maximum security facility.
What seemed like a simple, obvious thing to do at the time turned into a complete public policy nightmare here in Connecticut. It was announced out of the blue. No one knew this was coming, and all of a sudden we were told that A, there was a contract with Virginia, and B, buses were already en route to Virginia bringing Connecticut inmates down there. And I think many people, including myself, felt this is not a good idea. Even though it was a state prison, not a private prison, this is not going to work. And several of us went down to visit this place. None of these guys had been corrections officers a year earlier. They'd built this new prison, and all these guys got hired. They were all like unemployed coal miners. And here you got a bunch of unemployed white coal miners from Appalachia supervising a bunch of black and Latino guys from the cities of Connecticut, of all places.
In 2000, complaints about the transfer and treatment of inmates in the Wallens Ridge Prison led to the Connecticut Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities to investigate and conduct hearings on the matter. Also that year, the Legislative Program Review and Investigations Committee conducted the first recidivism study of convicted felony offenders in Connecticut.
So now, because of that study, and because the legislature has adopted it and taken it on and has some figures to work with, it has forced the department to look at the programs that they have. It has forced the state of Connecticut to examine, how do people get in prison? What are we doing wrong, and what could we do better to keep people out of prison? Because the idea is to get people, if they have to pay for a crime, certainly that's necessary. If there is to be redemption, or if there is to be a life after that crime, we have to find out how we can make certain that people serve their time, but are incorporated back into the community and not find themselves in a cycle where they're rearrested again.
In 2001, the General Assembly expanded presumptive sentencing authority, authorizing judges to depart for good cause from the mandatory minimum penalties for certain drug sale offenses. The tough-on-crime approach began transitioning to a more sophisticated means of administering criminal justice.
The easiest position for a politician to take is, let's just lock people up, throw away the key, have longer sentences, and not think about it in any greater detail. Being tough on crime is a politically safe position, whether it turns out to be an effective one in terms of public policy or not.
In January 2003, Central Connecticut State University hosted the Building Bridges from Conviction to Employment conference.
The last conference was a huge success because it brought policymakers and practitioners and community members together to talk about a lot of the problems around prisoner reentry. It created a lot of momentum, and that momentum has spurned a lot of these programs that we're seeing going on today. I think that momentum is what was a driving force behind last year's legislation.
So I think the accomplishments up to now has been just drawing attention to the issue. Things will happen, once you begin to make it known. It becomes an issue that's discussed. Now people will begin to say, oh yeah, I didn't realize that. Yeah, let's do this. So now you have churches involved, or people setting up organizations themselves, or areas of this state that you didn't think would recognize the problem of reentry or dealing with it, and how municipal governments are now beginning to think about that, organization for job training, issues related to employment, all of that. People begin to talk about it a bit more now. So some things will happen now that you've drawn more attention to it. Light is being shown on it.
In the 2004 legislative session, the General Assembly passed and the governor enacted Public Act 04-234, an act concerning prison overcrowding. Public Act 04-234 enacted to develop and implement a comprehensive reentry strategy for offenders discharged from prison in order to assist in maintaining the prison population at or under the authorized bed capacity, promote the successful transition of inmates from prison back to their communities, protect public safety, and support the rights of victims. The offender reentry strategy is intended to reduce recidivism as a method to control the state's persistent prison overcrowding problem.
So for years, we've just been sort of doing the same thing, getting the same results, and just spending a little bit more money and expanding the system. And so finally, we begin to focus in on the fact that, gee, maybe there's a way we can spend our money and get a better result. And the better result means less crime and more people being productive members of our society. And that's essentially what we're trying to move towards.
We really need to take a look to see, do we have the right people and are we using the right consequence when it comes to their criminal behavior? Not everybody needs to go to prison. And that's one of the issues that I think we're working on, is trying to identify those offenders who can best be supervised in the community without a risk to public safety. And obviously public safety is always the umbrella.
In July 2004, Governor Jody Rell ordered the Department of Correction to return all inmates transferred to out-of-state prisons back to Connecticut correctional facilities. By November 2005, all 500 inmates were returned to Connecticut. In the revised budget, the General Assembly also provided $13 million in funding for specific justice initiatives that were intended to control prison overcrowding, assist offenders as they transition from prison to the community, and enhance public safety.
The purpose of the Connecticut Building Bridges is to bring about change to help those people with the reentry. And the change is not about programs. Make that clear. It's about people. And if we remember that, we will all be better served for it. This is about setting a different course, and it's about full membership in society. It's also about hope. And I use that word a lot when I talk about these kinds of programs and where we can go, because it's hope, literally, that leads to so many positive things. If we don't have hope, where are we headed? And I think that's important. It also creates healthy neighborhoods, and it brings about a sense of belonging with a community. That's where the hope comes in. And I think, frankly, more than anything else, it helps to improve our quality of life. Because if people belong to a community, if they belong in a neighborhood, it improves everyone's lives altogether.
On January 12th and 13th, 2006, Building Bridges 2, an evaluation of Connecticut's Justice Reinvestment Initiative Conference, was held at Central Connecticut State University. Connecticut criminal justice policy and practice have seen many changes over the past 30 years. As the debate continues, it remains to be seen what the future will bring.
I think from my perspective as Majority Leader of the Senate, that there is, I think, a growing interest in trying to make sure that what we do is both cost effective and programmatically effective. I think that by and large people are willing to look at other alternatives to incarceration, perhaps more than they were a few years ago. I think that the fear about being tagged as being soft on crime is probably not as severe as it was a few years ago, and I think that treatment modalities have gone on now long enough that they have a good enough track record that they can be defensible, that it is not looked as just giving a break to criminals, that in many cases it is really as effective both for the individual and for the state.
Our goal with this conference is to have people talk about the issues that are important to them and what should be addressed in the future as far as reentry legislation goes or reentry types programs. The best way for that to happen, as we saw in the first conference, is that people are not afraid to talk about their views and experiences and their concerns, and more importantly to have those people listening hear those views and concerns with an open mind and think about how that can be turned into policy and practice.
It's really about getting people to look at the big picture, decide what are the outcomes we want to promote, figure out what's the most cost-effective way to get that done. And so I guess the interesting thing, 20 years after the mid-1980s, that people have moved from the simplistic solutions to the complicated solutions. And mainly because the simplistic solutions seem to all have unintended consequences, and we're paying for those now.
What I hope to accomplish with this conference this time around would be a level of sophistication that we've been able to move from one level to the next in terms of being able to identify the problem, being able to offer up remedy, resolution, know where you need to go, know who's doing what, how to interface with each other, being able to carry on a dialogue with other people, understanding a little bit better the extent of the problem that's there, what kind of things are needed by those who have a need for services of some kind, be it housing or family reconnecting or employment or transitioning back, or be it school, or how you can go about getting things done. So I think the one we're having this time around is moving to the next phase. The next phase is putting some meat to the bone. It is building some coalitions. It is people coming together. It is not everybody having to do it solo. That we can come together as groups of individuals, groups of organizations, groups of people with interest, and collectively devise something by which you can begin to address this issue a little bit better than it has been addressed.